Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm out for a night walk around the lake. The old lights have been replaced with LEDs, and they're hideously, viscerally, wrongly bright. Similarly, the lights in the wheeled demons that we call cars. Yesterday I was watching a diving water bird, small duck-like creature. Don't know the actual category in English, or the species, or the Linnaean classification. I was watching it diving in the social pond in the botanical gardens, and I got down on my knees so that I could be closer to the plane of the water's surface, which isn't exactly a plane, but this is a word we use to point in that direction. And I was watching the light, and there was a young woman who had approached on a vector right at me when I was doing Tai Chi earlier. And that vector was also right at a bench that she sat on. So there was plausible deniability about whether or not the approach was direct. And it was some ways from me, but as I finished Tai Chi and moved from where I was practicing to the lake, the young woman similarly moved and occupied a bench across from me on the lake, approximately the same distance away as the first bench. And what became immediately apparent to me, and this is apparent because I myself have a similar quality or characteristic, I immediately recognized that this young woman is feral. Doesn't mean that she doesn't sleep in a bed necessarily, or, doesn't sleep under a roof. I'm describing her by negations. It's funny. And she did appear to be doing that strange thing that other ferals recognize, which is to be actively paying attention to something that you do not wish to be known to be paying attention to. I found that situation very interesting. Females rarely approach, in my experience, females rarely approach males when they can avoid it, and especially here in the city. And even less commonly will they approach me. Why? For what purpose should they approach me? Being as I'm old and decrepit and, all the bad things. But I had no, I didn't necessarily find her attractive or even really see her in the way that I would ordinarily see a female human, because there were other behavioral, postural, body linguistic signals from that person that caused me to suspend the ordinary categorization until I had more data. And this is related to videos I've made previously where I talk about the process of encountering something that doesn't fit in our categories and the cascade of state changes, we could call them mode changes, transformations of mode, that happen in consciousness for most of us in response to this, unless we become familiar with it. And literally by familiar, I doubt that most English speakers put enough emphasis on the obvious inclusion of the word family, right? The same precursor root of fame, family, possibly even something like fabulous, although I understand the B makes it a different root. Lots of FA words, FA sounds. Phonemes do have meanings. We just, in English, are taught to pretend they mostly don't, unless we begin studying linguistics or semantics in some formal way, in which case we will quickly realize the little elements inside the words have complex histories of meaning and derivation and reflective likeness with that to which they refer. By familiar, I almost mean not part of our physical body, but not entirely different from that either. Part of our extended cognitive body, right? Because language, categories, and so forth make up a goodly portion of that anatomy. And so when we add a word or a category or a phoneme, now I know what that is. That was a balloon, right? That was a short in the electrical system. That was, I poured the boiling water into too thin a cup. It could not expand and distribute the heat quickly enough, so it shattered. And, in the first moment of it shattering, we don't know what's happened. We don't immediately link, the boiling water, the cup's thinness, wrong type of cup. Right? Pour the boiling water in a plastic cup, it melts. And we just so used to using the plastic cup for liquids that... So, in a sense, what happens is if you pour the water of identity into the cup of cognition, the mind, awareness, and the water is of a novel enough form, it may shatter the cup. And if the cup shatters, our identity shatters with it. In some cases, right? And then if we have a lot of experience with novelty, then we already know that there are many options other than stiffening up, right? Or freezing or fight. We can flow, right? So we could add to fight, flight, freeze, fawn, we could add the fifth F, flow. It's very difficult to damage. It's hard to hurt something that's mostly water with ordinary interactions. And if it's all water, it's even harder to harm it, right? Many of the martial arts absorb energy and redirect it rather than emitting it. Emitting it's expensive. Absorb, redirect is very pragmatically valuable in a combat of unknown duration, right? So when I saw the young woman, thin, kind of tallish, short black hair, baseball cap, black pants to the little below the knees, thin, no shoes on. Did not appear to be carrying shoes either. May have had a pack though. Look, if I do Tai Chi in public, and often I do it in a relatively secluded spot, but sometimes I don't. There's a couple of sort of public places where it's common for people to practice martial arts here, particularly the concourse between the museums. But sometimes if I'm practicing in public, it attracts some attention. I am not immune to the stimuli that human observation comprises. If I were extremely focused on what I was doing, I would be, mostly. A part of Tai Chi is to maintain situational awareness, a very unique form of it that gets the flavor rather than the category necessarily. It gets the flavor right. It can tell the difference between serious and confused, or serious and, 9 other things. Now I'm going to bird walk back to the beginning. So I'm going to circle back on the origin of the talk, which is one of the things I often do. And some people will say, man, what are you smoking? But they don't know me very well, because my mind circles, it orbits topics naturally, and more so if I'm writing or speaking about them. I'm not smoking anything. So I got down on my knees near the surface of the water. The girl who was observing me as I was observing the duck, and the sky was observing everything. The girl paid closer attention to me when I went down close to the water at the shoreline, which is, like cement. A cement curb. So I was watching the duck because it was diving. And I was curious how long it was spending underwater. But I also wanted to watch the way the ripples that the duck made by diving transformed the reflections and the light on the surface of the water. And so I was watching the duck. And soon I realized something that I found surprising, which was that the duck would dive, and it would be down for maybe 12 to 16 seconds by my count, and it would surface some distance away. I could imagine what it was up to down there. But when it dove, the quality of the ripples that were composed by the diving, or were resulted from the diving, they were different, it seemed to me, than the ripples that arose as a result of its surfacing. And that took me aback as I began to think I noticed that. I was surprised. This had never occurred to me, that for people who are really carefully watching water surfaces, they can tell maybe the difference between ripples that were produced by something rising from the bottom or something sinking from the surface. And probably the difference between those and something penetrating from the sky, right? Skydiving into the water. Now, of course, such things are true because we often hear people tell us, oh, our senses are so limited, we can only hear in this range, we can only smell in this range. We need X number of molecules per square centimeter of atmosphere to detect it at all, right? We only see in a very narrow band of the conceivable visible spectrum of light. All this. Not untrue entirely. And yet, at the same time, our senses are trainable. In other words, you can keep focusing the aperture of a sense, or you can multi-focus it, or you can dilate it. So, dilation is the opposite of dilation. In any case, what I'm trying to get at is, if you train your eyes over time to see very small differences, we might say, very small characteristics of visual phenomena, such as waves on the water, or even the different kinds of trails ants can make in dusty or light soil, or the different kinds of markings that insects which have landed on something may leave, including insect scat. Your senses will, like the aperture is developmentally nearly infinite. And so too the aperture for skillfulness, the apertures of skillfulness. We do reach sort of milestones on the curve, and the milestones often seem impenetrable. And there is on the curve, there are places where it seems like, okay, the other side of this is infinite. So to make a move from here is going to be difficult, right? Yeah, there are, what would I call them? Not milestones. They're almost like stair steps on a graph, where there are certain corners you get to at the next order or layer or step where it seems very unlikely you will make one more step up that ladder. But even then, progress still remains accessible. It just may not reach a new order or level. So I saw that the ripples made by diving differed very slightly in their appearance and structure from those made by surfacing. And this made me think of all kinds of things. But primarily, the first thing I thought of was it resembles falling asleep and waking up, which then, of course, led me to think, it resembles hypnagogia and hypnopompia. There's an analogy here. In the first case, think of it, the duck dives, the light mostly goes away. The lights go out. You got to carry the oxygen with you. And then swimming like a dream, right? And then the lights come back on and you can breathe again. You have to not breathe when you're underwater. What if the feelings that the humans have, oh my God, oh Jesus Christ. Okay. Oh, this is so ridiculous. All right. This has never occurred to me before just now. And I'm not used to having relatively world-shattering insights while I'm exploring a topic, because I'm usually going over terrain that I already know. But in this case, because I'm telling a story, I'm not just going over terrain that's already familiar to me. It's the first time I've told this story. So, all right. This is crazy. By the way, before I forget, I noticed that on the surface of the water, the waves from the diving and the waves from the surfacing often reached each other and interacted and produced a specific kind of interference with each other, specific kinds of interference. And that I did not chase much, but here's what came to me now. So, you take a big breath, you go underwater. It is as if you have gone to sleep in some ways. The hypnagogic liminal or twilight space is between you're still above the water partly, and then you're all the way under. And that would be the difference between you're not quite fully asleep and you're asleep. And that can be a gradual transition. It's not necessarily binary. And then you swim around under there. Then you come back up, and there's a transition between I'm going up, my head has surfaced, I am above the water, I can breathe. What if, and my friend George Gorman, I'm sure, would love this insight. You can find some of his work on the lowest middle icon on the index page of my website. He has a book-length manuscript called Nature's Mind, which is absolute genius in my view. So what if the reason during sleep paralysis we feel that we're not breathing is that we're doing what we used to do when we were sea creatures, and like whales and dolphins, we dove down and we slept. And in sleep, you might, I don't know what their habits are, I'm sure they vary, but you don't breathe underwater. And so when we awaken and we are in hypnopompic usually, between space, and sleep paralysis has arisen, we feel that we cannot breathe. We feel that we are not breathing. It is not clear whether those feelings are true. They feel absolutely true and terrifying if we're worried about it. And yet, it's not clear, like it's possible to be breathing and have no awareness that you're breathing, because that branch of the nervous system is otherwise occupied or in a feedback loop or something. But yeah, what if... Now, this idea has occurred to me before. I've said, I never linked it so intensely. I did say something like, suppose that in our dreaming we are like the whales we rise to the surface and take a breath from another world and then carry it down, down, down into the depths with us, shining, transmitting its life and light and intelligence to that other world. Something like this, yeah. A long time ago. Now, it's very important to understand that if in my thinking I believed or was even just acting under the habitual the habitual dominance of prevalent ignorance. And by prevalent ignorance, I mean knowing what things and processes and situations, quote, are, unquote, what they are, what that is. Because the moment that I know what it is, I'm going to stop paying meaningful attention to it unless it's on my list, right? Unless it's a threat or an opportunity. I mean, the three basic things on our lists are threats, opportunities, unknowns. No one expects the Darren Inquisition. Our primary threat, right? Our primary figures are threat, opportunity, the unknown, and that which is transforming. Our five list items. I could keep going, but yeah, for humans it's threats, opportunities, and unknown. An unknown, sometimes you can tell the base category is just like, okay, somebody's yelling at their shoe over there. It's not really a problem. I don't. But then it's already not unknown. I'm just saying there's some things that we will allow to remain ambiguous in consciousness because we don't wish to approach them closely enough to determine their specific or explicit identity. And it turns out that for humans, the whole opportunity landscape is identity. Because it turns out that intelligence hinges upon the number and skillfulness of the methods that we have to play in consciousness, explore, create the experience of identity. All of the problems in language are right there. All of the potentials for cognitive superfunction are right on that one little pivot. Well, it's not really a little pivot, it's a cone. The point's very sharp, but the cone is very tall. It might be infinitely tall and it gets wider as you go up it. So when you see a symbol, and there's a word for this symbol, I just can't remember it. when you see the symbol for the sun, it's a circle with a dot in the center. And it's useful to three-dimensionalize that symbol so that you realize that what you're either looking point down at a cone, or you're looking circle inward at a cone, so that you realize, it is the whole periphery, and it is the summation of that periphery at the point. This is how human cognition actually works. It works using this one primary function, which is go from circle to point, go from everything to something to that thing, or the reverse, go from that thing to similar things, to all things, to everything. Then, if you're intelligent, go from there to origin. Or if you're religious, because for either of the religions, either theism or scientism, materialism, physicalism, for all those, there is a ring that the point condenses into discrete identities and phenomena. And the ring is origin. And for physicalism, it's mechanics of matter. And for theism, it's God. There's lots of other isms we could examine. So I was watching the bird diving and surfacing, and I realized, the ripples are different for each of these. And also, where they intersect, very profound. Now, if diving is hypnagogia, often we have no conscious experience of those transitions. And I think there's more than one transition going on there. Though we can label it one if it's useful. And then if the swimming underwater, holding our breath, is dreaming, and the surfacing is hypnopompia, and the completion is waking consciousness. Right? We go from waking consciousness into the dive in the first move. We return from the dive in the final move. And then we can actually see on the surface of the water, if we are the duck, we can see the ripples made by our dive. We can see the ripples made by our rising. What might that correspond to if the analogy is good for humans? And the transitions we experience usually nocturnally. What are those ripples? And what are they ripples in? What is analogically correlated with the surface of the water? What is analogically correlated with the light on the surface of the water? What is analogically correlated with the eye that sees from outside the duck? These are questions we must reasonably pursue, whether or not the analogy here is as profound as I currently sense it to be and trust that it is. If it's not profound at all, still turns out to be very useful to pursue, because these are features of our actual experience as humans. Yes, the features have been determined or the features have been sketched by my purposive orientation in thought and concern and consciousness. But even that thing can't help but have its own origins fingerprint in it. And so too, the duck, the water, the ripples, their interference with each other, my observation of this, and then the sky above me, which is reflected in the water, the girl on the other side of the lake, looking at me. It's not easy to determine what parts of the experience I describe are mostly the inventions of my perspective and concerns, as is true with anything. Sorry, I'm waiting a moment because there's some loud engine noise here. But I got the sense, the specific character of my perception of that person's, the character of their attention was that I was seen, I felt as if I was being looked at, like the character of what I could perceive of the gaze from far off was that I was being looked at as either a threat, prey, or a challenge. I certainly wasn't challenging anyone. I wasn't threatening anyone. Tai Chi is quite slow and looks more like dancing than fighting. I heard something very interesting in listening to an Okinawan martial arts teacher. This is probably well known by older martial artists and some of their students. He said, in China, if you were a martial artist back in the day, they would send assassins, right? They would send soldiers to kill you because you pose a threat to the structured hierarchical authority system and so forth. Yeah. So the martial artists quickly learned that you couldn't publicly practice at all ever, because if anyone figured out that you were a martial artist, there'd be serious trouble, not just for you, possibly for your loved ones, and all kinds of trouble. All kinds of trouble. So what they did is they slowed everything down, right? They hid the moves, hid the forms, the structured sequences of attack, defend, compensate, rebalance, attack, defend, take a breath. Similar to dive, dream, wake, right? The dreaming in this case is the rebalancing or rejuvenation between, life or death exertions. So they slowed the forms and they hid the movements in stuff that could be they encrypted it. They encrypted martial arts in dancing, and you find this in cultures probably in Java, Indonesia, the Philippines, China, Japan, many other cultures, South America. Once it becomes deadly, whatever bullies or pirates or villains, whatever robbers and rapists and thieves and murderers and gang of Ronin in Japan come upon a little farming town, who will stop them? Only chance is a martial artist or two. And we have films about this, right? Seven Samurai and so forth, yeah. So yeah, they hid everything in dance. They hid it in art. They made it look creative and playful and beautiful. And they were able to conserve the forms that had been developed generation to generation and transmit them to new generations via these methods. So in a sense, it was like encrypting a defense asset, right? Now, of course, eventually you're going to have the same problem, right, where the bad guys will pay snitches surreptitiously to point out anyone who's dancing this way. All of life understands a principle that is prevalent in combat training, which is the conservation of energy. When I was listening to the old Okinawan martial artist, veteran of many combats, not just a dojo teacher, right? Someone who had to fight a lot, and often with other martial artists. He said something that I've heard from other martial artists, which is that much of martial arts is kind of a game. In an actual conflict, the first thing that goes out the window is any kind of rules about fair fighting or anything resembling that. Once it goes to physical combat, you don't have time to test the water. It's too dangerous to test the water to determine, is this a combat to dominance, where one of the combatants gives up, or is it a combat to death? And you don't know. So you never treat it as if it's, unless it's previously agreed, you never treat it in actual combat. It's always destroy the other person's capacity to continue to fight, and if necessary, them. So various martial arts that are serious train in this, though we imagine they also train the sensitivity of the practitioner, so they don't just unleash lethal force on an unsuspecting challenger, right? Because most of the challengers you will encounter modernly are not, they don't intend for it to go to you know, till death do us part. So if you were to just unleash lethal force on them, certainly you'd be seen as a deranged person. But most of the old methods come from times when a lot of the fighting was life or death. So they trained in a lot of like asymmetric advantage, first strike. First 3 strikes completely, unless the opponent is extremely skillful, they will completely destroy that person's capacity to continue the engagement. So these are things like eye rips, throat crushing, groin crushing, limb breaking, neck breaking, double ear pounds, right, where you bring fists together at the end of a whip motion. You bring the fists together at both ears or temples simultaneously, producing, brain bleeds and so forth. The old martial arts took death seriously, I suppose. It's a very grim topic. I myself have never been a combatant. I don't want to hurt anyone, ever. I imagine that if trapped, I may have the capability to do so. But it's not the kind of thing I think about or practice. I don't practice arts of death. And I understand why it is traditional for men and women to do so. It's very exciting to see women who are, skillful at the old arts, so that one realizes very clearly that if somebody were to pose a threat to them, A, it's unlikely they'd succeed, and B, things would go badly for that unfortunate idiot. I remember seeing a social media video where in some other country, perhaps it was, wild guesses here, Taiwan, Singapore, China, Japan, looked more rural than what I know of Japan. A woman is walking down a broad, wide street, and she's carrying her purse. And a man drives up to her purse side on a scooter, gets off the scooter, reaches for the purse, which she flings to her right. And as the man is chasing the purse, she mounts the scooter and drives away on it. Right? It's a bait and switch. An illustration of a peculiar form of relatively nefarious bait and switch. Difficult to know whether that actually took place or whether that was produced for the social media audience, because that kind of thing is very contagious, right? It's a good way to get views. I have returned to my home, and as always I am grateful for this time we spend together, and wish you beautiful lives and dreaming and opportunities and relationships till next we meet to learn together again very soon. Bye-bye. for now.